Welcome to our sixth Northern Virginia Tableau user group meeting. We appreciate everybody that's joining. If you haven't already joined us on LinkedIn, feel free to search for us under Nova Tableau user group for LinkedIn and join us, and we'll jump on there and get you on the group, and you can see some of our announcements, and we tend to post the presentations on there as well. So please join us and get to that. I'm going to just run through real quickly. The user group leaders, Sebastian Stossel, myself, Brian Liverman, Patrick Marino, and Jeff Hess are the leaders for the Tableau user group, and appreciate all the help everybody's put through to this. Our biggest helper this month for this meeting is Patrick, so I'm going to turn this over to Patrick now. This is our agenda, just real quickly, for everything. So our welcome and updates, our presentation, maybe a little trivia if we have time afterwards, and any additional wrap up and questions and so forth at the end of the session. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce Patrick Marino and let him jump over and do a quick introduction of our guest speaker. And I will turn it over to you, Patrick, and I will.
Okay, I'll try to limit myself. I have a hard time doing that. But I just wanted to mention that I was a programmer for about 15 years, and I switched from development to database work. And then I missed the development, development type of work. So I started getting into doing business intelligence, a lot of visual analytics. And I was doing a lot of reports in Crystal. I was doing work with SSRS, and then I saw the capability. They actually wanted me to work at Microsoft, working at Power BI. And I just happened to take a look at Tableau because my son was going to college, and Tableau was one of the courses that he was going to be taking. And I really liked it. So I bought a lot of different books, and I started training myself. And I must have about a dozen books. And then I picked up the book, Communicating Data with Tableau. And anybody who knows me, I say this is a must-have if you want to do Tableau work. And it really changed how I looked at doing business intelligence, data visualization, and I read that book all the time. I really, in fact, a lot of my Tableau public site is geared to a lot of the examples and concepts in the book, and I just think it's just really changed my direction, and it kind of made me solidify this is the direction I want to go in. So, and Ben Jones was a person who wrote the book. So I've been trying to get him for a user group meeting. And we've been going through this for a couple months. He's been real busy, but now we finally have a time that he can do the presentation. So I'm very excited to introduce Ben Jones. And again, thank you very much, because I'll tell you, it really helped me point the direction I want to go into. And I hope that people get a lot out of this as much as I got out of his book and his other books as well, too.
Okay. Thanks a lot, Patrick. Yeah, that's nice to know. I was really thankful for the time I was able to spend at Tableau to reach out and connect with people like you, and this journey we were all on, really discovering effective ways to communicate with data, and learned as much as I was able to learn from many people, and hopefully shared some things as well. So I'm happy to join today. Thank you for inviting me. And I would like to say hello to everyone. I'm here on the West Coast in Seattle. And so we're coming into the afternoon hours here. I know you all are coming close to dinner time, but I want to be able to spend the next hour with you all roughly. And I want to leave time for Q&A also at the end. And I've made a new presentation for you all that I want to kind of share some thoughts about exactly that topic, which is communicating data and how to do that well. I had a chance to work with journalists over the years as I led the Tableau public platform, and they taught me a thing or two that I think would be very useful, both in the boardroom, on the shop floor, other places where we're trying to use data to shape our decisions and our culture. There's things that we can do as we interact with other human beings, and to relay data to them in such a way that it affects their points of view, perhaps, and as well as the direction that they feel we should head in. And there's some great techniques and approaches that will help us to become more effective in the way we communicate. Some of these tips are technical, others are more practical or theoretical, others are human-based, so more interpersonal, if you will. A few of all of those. We're going to mix them together And I want to be able to just, like I said, get your thoughts as well on some of these different approaches. And, would like to know what works well for you, what you've learned over the years as you've presented data, whether you've done that with Tableau or, as Patrick mentioned, other tools as well, like SRSS or many of these visual analytics platforms now that are revolutionizing the way we work with data. So I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll jump into it and get started. And again, we have chat open. I'm looking at the chat right here. So if you have any thoughts or comments, just feel free to type them in if you want. And since we only have a few dozen people, this is actually like the perfect class size that I teach, right around 20 to 30. So what that allows us to do is just unmute and, just share your thoughts like that as well. You don't need to worry about that. That would be perfectly fine with me. So feel free to do that as we go along. If something I say triggers a thought that you have, just unmute and let me know, and we can kind of go off any slides or script or anything like that, right? So that would be great. Toronto Tug. Wow. Let's talk about that afterward. That's actually my original hometown near Toronto. So that's where I was born. So potentially that might be something we could put on the calendar here real soon. Thanks,
Ben.
Yeah,
thanks,
sure.
Ben. This is Ojo here from the Toronto Tug. We'd like to have you speak at the community here. We are a small team, but more of that after. Yes.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, we'll just, I led the Los Angeles Tableau user group. Now, this is back in 2012 when pretty much no one had really heard of Tableau. I would have to work really hard just to get 5 people to show up. There was really no Zoom tool. I think WebEx existed back then, but and that was back when everything was actually in person, not virtual. So I know what it's like to run
right?
Yeah, I know, and I know all the work that goes into finding speakers and and communicating with your user group members. So a lot of respect for people out there spending their own time and energy bringing groups together like you all are, and happy to contribute because, as I said, I've been on the Tug leader side of the coin, and I was there for a few years prior to leaving Los Angeles to come up here to Seattle to join Tableau. So a little bit about me. I actually left Tableau almost exactly 2 years ago, 2 years and a week. I left Tableau and I started up my own business called Data Literacy at dataliteracy.com. My background is in mechanical engineering and business and entrepreneurship. But really, Tableau was my springboard into the business intelligence world. And I'm really thankful for the time I got to spend there, for the many, many things I learned and the amazing people I met. And I've since then, actually beginning with my time at Tableau, began writing, as I'll talk about, and teaching. I teach here at the University of Washington, right here in Seattle. And I was able to run the Tableau public platform as well as our academic programs team before switching into what we call an evangelist role with Andy Cotgreave, who you may know, a close friend of mine. And I would blog and things, and that's really what got me into writing about data and teaching people some things that might be helpful to them. When I'm not plugged into data or Zoom or whatever else, I love to spend time in nature, which I get a lot of opportunities to do up in this part of the world, hiking in the trails or even backpacking overnight or skiing. I used to play team sports a lot more than I do now with kids in a business, but definitely am a huge fan of soccer and volleyball and things like that. Going to UCLA, I had to learn basketball, whether I liked it or not. So that's a bit about me and the personal side of things. So these are some of the books that I have written. There's one other one that's a very small book. It's only 25 pages. These are all a couple hundred pages plus. But I really like working with data and I really enjoy writing about it. So it started back in 2014 with the book that Patrick mentioned, Communicating Data with Tableau. A little over a year ago, I launched a book called Avoiding Data Pitfalls, which was really kind of sharing my journey of blunders and mistakes that I noticed a lot of my students were making very similar kinds of mistakes as they went through their initial stages of the journey working with data. And so I tried to find a fun and relatable way to tell some of the stories of those errors and what I learned from them, and hopefully give you some resources to be able to avoid making some of them yourself, perhaps. And then just this year, it's been a busy year. Back in July, we published my own publishing company now, Data Literacy Press. We launched the Data Literacy Fundamentals book and course, which is really geared toward helping people get over what I call data phobia. This is probably not you all because you're in a Tableau user group, but what I was pretty surprised to learn as I left Tableau to start my business is that there's a whole host of people out there that really don't feel like they have any idea about how to get started with data. They feel very much left behind. They don't know where to get started. This whole topic is very scary. And so I wanted to introduce them to very simple concepts like, what is data and how do teams use it? Also, what's the point of working with data? What should we hope to accomplish with it? How do we look at it or display it, as well as what are different ways of breaking it down or analyzing it? So that was a very kind of introductory, foundational type set of content that we released to the world. And then just yesterday, actually, published a book, my next one this year, called Learning to See Data, which is all about interpreting the visual language of charts. A close friend of mine and a board member, RJ Andrews, advised me before I left Tableau that I needed a course just about helping people read charts and graphs. I was a little surprised. I thought, people know how to read a bar chart, and he'd tell me, you'd be surprised. So, and he turns out he was right. The more I started my business, I realized that companies wanted something for the consumer or interpreter, reader of a chart. And so also what I learned was being able to articulate those thoughts well translates actually into the world of the person who's trying to create that chart that is being consumed. So the content really works for people on both sides of that equation, the person creating the chart as well as the person reading it. And so that's one that just came out yesterday. On Monday, we'll release the course. It's actually open to public beta right now on our site at a pretty big discount if you're interested in that. So that's what I do. I love writing. Like I said, I love writing about data, teaching it, training it, working with organizations and teams. I've been really lucky to have some early customers in the US federal government, as well as other organizations that are interested in this content and deploying it to their teams. So we had the opportunity knowing that it was going to be used. And that was a real blessing for us and for this entire team of mine. Okay, so that's a bit about me and what I do. These are the courses and just, where you can go onto our own online learning platform on our site and kind of get steeped in these concepts. They're full of quizzes and exercises and diagrams and definitions and instructional videos, about 4 hours of video content in each one, broken down into nice small 5-10 minute sections. So you don't have to sit there and watch a whole movie. You can just watch them in little bits and pieces as you go along through your day or through your week. So that's the way we created it. Okay, so here are my 5 tips that I want to walk you through that I believe were helpful for me as I sought to improve my communication skills as it related to data. So really thinking about data as just another message, another medium that I could convey to my audience, and thinking about ways to perfect that. And I will say this, I think that this skill, being able to communicate well with data, is really, really important for anyone looking to grow their career in analytics or even in leadership with data. These are the people that are shaping the organizations that we work for, also the government agencies that help us run our society, to be able to do that well. And that's a huge skill today. It's so, so important. So I came up with 5 tips, and I want to kind of go through maybe 1 or 2 specific points in each one of these in the next 45 minutes or so. And as I said, having a conversation hopefully with you all as we go along. Alrighty, so let's start with this first one. A lot of times we think about data, and the very first thing we need to understand is, well, what does the data say? And many times when we're analyzing data using Tableau or other tools, we start answering questions right away, with that data. And that's great. But I have found, and what I teach in my class, is this overall kind of approach. This is what I would call our level 2 framework that you can apply to Tableau or any other tool for that matter, which is essentially saying, how do we dive in to data, extract and mine it for its insights, convert it into key findings, use those findings to actually grow in wisdom. And so the framework is sort of designed to be a stair step. Why? Because we want data to be a journey to a higher place, like we ascend a staircase. And it also forms this acronym WISDOM. And so the 4 steps here, right, would be wondering what's happening and observing and coming up with questions and hypotheses. And then we seek for that data and structure it, then we discover what's there. Then we mature by presenting it to others, turning it into decisions, enacting those decisions, observing what happens and going back to the beginning. All the while being able to stop at any point and realize that There's a more important question perhaps in the middle of that process. And so it isn't a linear process like it might seem here. It's very iterative, and we loop back as we come up with unanticipated questions as the data reveals itself to us, and allowing for that messiness, if you will, and even embracing it, okay? So there's a step very early on in getting our hands on a raw data set, which people forget and they miss. And it's called exploring the contours of our data. And this is a phrase that a friend of mine, Michael Mixon, he works at Pluralsight on Adam Crahan, his team. You may know Adam as a Tableau Zen master, but one time on Twitter, Mike had that exact quote, exploring the contours of the data. And it stuck with me because it really, to me, was this perfect vision or visual of, almost like walking around the perimeter of a set of data, seeing what's there, sizing it up, scoping it out, seeing its mins and maxes and its overall, distribution. And so I kind of thought about it like maybe sailing around an island. I grew up in Los Angeles. There's these Channel Islands off the coast of Los Angeles, like Catalina. And, the idea there being there's a shoreline and there's an island. Maybe there's more than one island. And so if we're going to learn about this place, we're going to need to be very diligent about checking it out. And so this plays into an interesting story I want to tell you, and I think you'll see the relationship, hopefully, to your data. So before I begin, though, I'd actually just like to get you all to interact with me a little bit here. And I'd like to know, as you look at these 6 maps, what's the one thing that's missing on all of them? Can anybody tell me? Look closely. There's a certain thing that's missing in every one of these maps. So look at it and then let me know what you think. And it's actually, it turns out, and you can just put it in the chat if you want, or just unmute. Yeah, so some of them are missing legends. Some of them maybe don't need them because they're just all gray. So people are mentioning Antarctica. It's actually true. And that is true. That is one thing that's missing from all of them. So is something maybe a little bit more surprising that is very close to Antarctica, or relatively close anyway, certainly closer than we are to Antarctica. And it's a place name that is often missing in world maps. It's notoriously common that world maps leave off, and it's a country, one specific country that is oftentimes left off of world maps. Indra got it. It's New Zealand. There's actually a website called World Maps Without New Zealand, even I think a Reddit site where people just, most likely, I would guess many of them from New Zealand, grouchily sharing, here's yet another world map where our country was left off of the map, okay? So speaking of New Zealand, it turns out, here's New Zealand. It turns out that the first European to, I think probably accidentally actually, stumble upon New Zealand, the Maori people were already discovering it and living there for many years, but Abel Tasman back in 1642 found his way on the Zeehan, and as well as a couple other ships, to New Zealand. Now he sailed around, he checked it out, okay? And he called this area, of what you see right here, Zeehan's Bight, okay? And now a bite, not like B-I-T-E, like a bite out of a sandwich, actually B-I-G-H-T, which happens to be a crescent shape in a coastline. Remember I mentioned the Channel Islands off the coast of Los Angeles, like Catalina? Well, this map in the bottom right shows that kind of crescent-shaped bight, okay? So he called this area Zeehan's Bight. And the reason is because he didn't look very closely. He and his crew didn't notice what James Cook and his crew noticed over a century later, that there's actually a navigable waterway between what is actually 2 totally different islands, North and the South Islands of New Zealand. And that area is no longer called Zeehan's Bight. If you go there today, it's called Cook Strait, after James Cook and his crew. And so the point is, one of these 2 explorers did a thorough job of exploring the contours of the island. And that's why that place is named after that person, not the other person. And so oftentimes, as I related to and thought about this story, it feels like this is what we do with data a lot. We take a quick look at it. We sort of think we see what's there. And then we start making a bunch of assumptions and calling things what we want to call it, and maybe presenting it and talking about it. But we haven't looked closely enough to notice maybe even sometimes some incredibly important, maybe albeit small, details, like the fact that if you really sail all the way into this depression here, you'll notice that there's a break in the islands, actually. And that's a very fundamental trait about New Zealand, that there are two islands. And so Tasman, I think probably Tasmania, the nearby island, was named after him. So at least he still got his name on something, right? But not Zeehane's Bight. And so think about that next time you work with a data set. Okay, are you exploring its contours closely enough so that you don't miss these really critical details that might be giving you a completely different perspective about what it is that the data contains? Now, I want to make it a little more than just a fluffy story like this. So in my level 2 class, I'm going to go ahead and teach it because I think I'm going to go ahead and share it with you all, because I thought about what it meant to explore the contours of a data set. Like specifically, what is it that we look for? We're not looking for gaps between islands. This isn't an island, it's a data set. So we came up with 10 simple questions here that we think might be helpful as you explore the contours of your data set. Things like, what's the granularity of that data, or what does a single row or record mean? Or how many total records are there, or different variables or attributes? Or what are the types of variables? Are there dates? Are there geographic fields, right? Are some of those categorical or quantitative in nature? Are some of the variables unique in some way, or maybe we would think of them even as a primary key in database lingo? What about the boundaries? Think about it like coming to that island, right? Maybe I want to see how high or low this coastline reaches. So almost like the altitude or elevation. Same thing with quantitative variables. What are the mins and maxes? Is there a population variable? What's the largest one? What's the smallest one? Is there a time variable? When does the time start? When does that time end? Many times we don't know. What about the quantitative variables and their shapes? Are they normally distributed, or are they log normal, or do they follow a power law, or are they uniform, or are they completely random? So these are critical questions to get our handle on them before we use the data set to actually answer any questions. Now, I would like the Tasman Sea. Oh, thanks, Britton. Yeah, that's another name. So maybe Abel Tasman got his name on more than one thing in spite of his lack of being thorough. So I wanted to give a simple story of one time I was jumping to conclusions, let's say, interacting with data. I talk about this in Avoiding Data Pitfalls, which is this book right here that came out last year from Wiley & Sons. And so the idea was that one time, it's actually kind of a relevant topic and for your part of the world as well. So I was curious in finding out presidents of the United States, and how many years they lived, let's just say. So I found a simple Wikipedia table which just listed all the presidents of the United States and then when they served, things like, their age, when they were born, when they died. Okay. This whole kind of simple table, not a complicated table in any way. So I thought it was going to be a fairly simple exercise of just kind of visualizing the history of the presidents of the United States. And actually, I think this example works its way into communicating data with Tableau as well. But the idea is that what I found is, I wanted to answer a simple question, which was, how long did these presidents live? Okay, so I took this table out of Wikipedia, was able to scrape it directly using Google Sheets. If you don't know that function, it's import HTML. Right there in cell A1 in Google Sheets, you can type in equals import HTML, and it'll guide you through how to pull pull a table right out of the website. So I did that. And then I imported it into Tableau, which has a connector to Google Sheets, which is very convenient. And then I just created a simple bar chart that showed me the ages of each of these presidents. Basically, and what you see here is something that really got me confused. So I noticed right away that Grover Cleveland, according to my data, seemed to live to 142 years of age. And that seemed to be quite a confusing sort of a thing, And so I'm curious if anybody knows why I ended up with that wrong answer. And if you can guess what Grover Cleveland's age when he died really was. I'm curious if anybody has any guesses. Yeah, you all are nailing it right on the head. He had multiple terms and he was 71. That's right. Because if you scroll down that table in Wikipedia, you notice that Grover Cleveland is not only does he have 2 terms, but they were not consecutive terms. Benjamin Harrison served in between Cleveland's first and second term in office, just like this. And actually, I believe it's the only one to have that happen. And so what I assumed was a unique element of each row, the president's name, is not actually unique at all. And because Grover Cleveland broke that rule, he appears in 2 different rows in this table. What was actually unique was just the presidential number, okay? And that's also an interesting variable, really, if you think about it, because it isn't as simple as saying that number increments every 4 years. It might increment 4 years. It might increment in 8 years. It might increment in the case of, let's say, JFK in less than 4 years for the case of a president who was either assassinated or died while in office. So it's an interesting variable, right? That president number. Okay, we know we're coming from 45 to 46 happening right now. And so, again, that's a very kind of in itself a curious variable to think about. But my assumption, again, without really exploring the contours of the data and without remembering back to high school US history class, was that every row here would have a unique president name. And it's just not true. Okay, so that is, and so, yeah, I think Jeff made a good point here. You could use the average instead. That's also exactly, kind of different levels of aggregation would be used, knowing now what I know about the structure of this table and the contours of this table. Now, sometimes it can be helpful to look closely and find out those sorts of interesting quirks or what have you about the data. Other times we stumble on them as we analyze, and sometimes it can be okay. In many cases, people say to me, well, how do you know if your data is dirty or not? First of all, I say, well, you can accept before anything else that it is. And then the next thing I like to do is I like to, visualize it. You can also use data catalogs like Elation or data.world or something like that. Oftentimes now they give you a very comprehensive metadata view or picture of the data. I also love Tableau Prep for this. In fact, sometimes, you know what I do? I import a data set into Tableau Prep to do nothing other than look at the preview pane in the middle of the window. I drag the data set out. I just say insert step. I go into that step. It gives me all the distributions of all the variables. I can quickly see what's there. It's a bird's eye view of the data. Again, before I dive into it, maybe I don't do anything else than that. That's something I use Tableau Prep for, to give me that bird's eye view of maybe a data set that I've never seen before. So care needs to be taken when we approach a new data set, and we need to explore its contours pretty thoroughly before we start using it to answer questions or present or jump to any conclusion. And so that's why that's the very first communication tip, is to know your data. Oftentimes what I've found is, there is a gap between data and reality. We've seen this year with COVID data. We know that it's confirmed cases, not actual cases. Things like that are true about almost every single data set you can think about. In fact, just today, something big happened. Major League Baseball just admitted the Negro Leagues into the classification of major league statistics. So when I was a kid growing up, there was this mythical baseball number. I don't know if you know it. The mythical baseball number was 755. What was that number? That was the number of home runs that Henry Aaron had hit in the course of his career on the Brewers and the Braves, most of the Braves. But we can take a look at his career before joining Major League Baseball, and we notice that he actually played in the Negro Leagues. And so what does that mean? That means now actually, this is true, is that the fact that actually he hit 760 professional home runs now, because he hit 5 in his 26 official games in the Negro Leagues. My point is that, and actually I use this exact, it's kind of ironic because I use this exact example in the book. And I just noticed this morning that they made this official change. And my point in the book is that people say, when I say, oh, there's always a gap between your data and reality, people always say, well, come on, give me a break. Like, let's think about baseball home runs. Like it's not like they forgot a number, or it's not like there was any doubt as to whether it was a home run or not. I mean, it's a home run. It's a home run. It got captured. The statisticians put it into the tables. You can read in the newspapers going back 100 years. And that's when I say, oh yeah, well, interesting. You say that. What about the Negro Leagues? What about the All-Stars? What about the playoffs? The 755 number didn't include any of the home runs that Hank Aaron hit in those places. Well, now it includes the ones from the Negro Leagues. It still doesn't include the ones from the All-Star game when he plays against the best possible other baseball players, nor in the playoffs when it matters the most, one could argue. And so there's always a gap between data and reality, okay? And so it's good for us to embrace that, to understand it, and then to really dive into the data to see what's there so we know what that gap is. Okay, and I'm sure you can think about this too, right? It isn't customer satisfaction. It's what people are willing to say on a survey for the people who are willing to respond, to that survey. Maybe not everyone was sent the survey. Okay, so these are interesting nuances and details about the data that need to be taken into account when we form conclusions based on our analysis of that data. Okay, so now once we have a firm appreciation, not just for the nuances and the quirks and the maybe even the blemishes of the data, but also we've analyzed it and we know it's there and we've got some important findings. Well, before we can communicate well, we need to know that audience. Who are they? What's their scenario? What do they care about? What are they trying to accomplish? And, this is a very tough question to answer sometimes. If you're a journalist, like the folks I got to work with when I was running Tableau Public, maybe they know who their readers are. Maybe their news organization has shared with them some details about, their reader profiles. Here was what an average person of Wall Street Journal looks like. I don't know. But really, they're publishing it to the web, and this could be something that anyone could find, perhaps. Maybe if you're presenting to your team, you know who those people are, exactly who they are, and maybe what their background might be, their role within the organization. So it's a small, contained, and highly known audience as opposed to a large and completely unknown audience, and everything in between. I also need to give some thought. Am I presenting to them live like I am right now? Am I sending them an email or a link to something? Am I recording something they can watch later, perhaps for the folks that are watching this recording? So what is the modality of my presentation to them? Also, can they do interesting things like interact with my presentation? Is it static or animated? These are all factors or variables that play into this exchange of minds, okay? And so I really like this. Actually, I'll show you a book that I use when I teach my classes right here called Visualization Analysis and Design. It's by Tamara Munzner. She is a researcher up at the university and professor in the University of British Columbia, close to Vancouver. This is the most thorough book I know of. It's graduate level textbook, but it's an amazing set of insights about visualization, okay? It's not an easy read because it's very thorough and in-depth. But she talks about this notion of task abstraction. This is actually a diagram from her book. Now notice there's squares inset into each other, almost like, think of it like layers of an onion, okay? We have outer layers, inner layers. And so she teaches in the book that if you're going to create a visualization for someone, you've got to think about them along 4 different lines of inquiry. The first is outer orange box, okay, called the domain situation. Now, what this means is, okay, who is the audience? What do they care about and why? All right, and what are they doing today? How are they going about their day today? So let's give an example. Let's say we want to create a dashboard for a real estate agent who's helping people find homes, okay? All right, so the real estate agent is motivated by helping a family get into a home that they're going to be happy with. They're also motivated about the income they can make from that process, okay? And so they care about it for themselves and their family as well as for the families they're helping. So maybe that's the domain, maybe that's a situation, okay? I'm trying to make a tool for a real estate agent. By the way, that would be very different than making a tool for an economist at Housing and Urban Development, right? Or a person who is trying to sell their home by themselves, perhaps, right? So these are all very different domains, and it's really helpful for us to put our finger on the exact domain, hopefully, that we can really win that user and that audience. and accomplish something great for them. Okay, the more narrow the domain, the more specific we can be. But the next question, and again, this is a layer within, and notice we'll start at the top. We're actually going to come out the bottom of this box and think about all these layers again. But if we start at the top, we go from the orange domain into the yellow data task abstraction, which is saying, okay, what's the task? What are they trying to do today? And what data do they need for that task? So if their task is get a person in my car to a home that is on their wish list, okay? That's my task. What's the data I have? I have all the listings and the variables or factors of those listings, as well as my family that I'm helping and what they want, right, in a home, both perhaps wants and needs. And so that's the data task abstraction layer. So now, okay, I'm not just thinking about the real estate agent trying to make a profit and help a family. I know that they're putting that family in their car, driving them down the street to a house to see a home that's on the market that meets their criteria. Okay, fair enough, right? Now, hopefully, as I'm saying this, you're thinking about other users or perhaps an audience that you might be interacting with, okay, and then what they're doing. Now, the next thing is what's the encoding? And we'll talk a lot about encodings here in a minute, but what's the encoding or the interaction? In other words, what's the best way for the person to actually see this data represented in graphical or visual form? Is it a map? Is it a list? Okay. And then how are they interacting with that data? Okay. Are they actually filtering it? Are they zooming in or out? What do they need to do to interact with this kind of encoding to help them do the task? Lastly, and often forgotten, is the algorithm abstraction, which is how well does this thing need to work? Are they using their phone? Do they have a laptop in their computer car or a tablet maybe? Screen size, pixels, width, right? How fast does it need to refresh? Does it use data from yesterday or last week, or does it need to be refreshed up to the last hour? So those are questions that really are totally make or break for the audience, because I might give them a perfect tool, but let's say they keep driving families to homes that are no longer on the market. They're going to get really frustrated with maybe a perfectly designed visual. And then they come back to me and say, this is no good. I've got a lot of unhappy families that have just wasted their afternoon. Why? Because, the data is not updated enough. So this gets into maybe some technical requirements like memory, refresh speed, again, pixels and widths and technical kinds of details. But then on our way out of this onion, right, down the bottom, we can actually, once we specify these things, we can test against them, okay? We can do tests to test each one of these levels. We can assess and analyze the results, ask them what they thought. Did they understand the chart? What did they observe? What questions did they have? When they used it, maybe I can do some human factors kinds of studies, all right? What about after we deploy it, right? Well, maybe I can do a ride along and see them using this tool and come up with some studies or observations. At the end of the day, we can look at it and say, well, hey, out of 100 real estate agents in a tri-county area, 40% of them are using it. Is that good? Is that bad? Again, that's an adoption rate kind of a thing where we're actually seeing, did we actually help someone so much or enough that they changed what they do by actually using a tool we made, right? That's the point. So this know your audience is super important. It doesn't matter what tool you use. If you don't understand this part of the equation, then you're going to present things to people that don't help them do their jobs. You're going to show them things that don't answer the questions they have. You're going to give them tools that are useless or even maybe frustrating in some ways. And again, it all comes down to not knowing your audience, right? So this isn't about learning how to click and drag or drop or code or whatever, right? This is really about thinking about the human scenario. Okay, let's move along here. So let's talk about the effective encoding types. Now, most times when we approach this next question about how do we show the visual, we often think of it in terms of chart types. Which chart should I choose? And these are the 25 main charts we talk about in our Data Literacy Level 1 course that we're about to launch on Monday. And so I would actually argue, though, that that's not the best first question to ask yourself. What chart type should I make? I mean, maybe if you're at an advanced level of fluency creating charts, this probably is where you start because you already know what I'm going to suggest next, which is that you think about it in terms of graphical marks and encoding channels. Let me stop and just explain for a moment what I mean by this. Now, in Tableau speak, you're going to talk about the marks card area, okay? There's different kinds of graphical marks in there, right? There's circles or points or shapes. There's lines we can create, even maybe areas or polygons perhaps. And these are different types of graphical marks, right? Think of it, points are 0D, lines are 1D, one dimension, areas are 2 dimensions. Tableau, for good reason, doesn't use a 3rd dimension graphical mark because projecting a three-dimensional object into a screen or a piece of paper can be very confusing as it relates to our ability, as we'll see in a moment, to decode the quantities and the true proportions of the data using those 3D marks. So we'll keep it simple for now. I happen to be a dreamer and think that one day VR and AR will allow us to use 3-dimensional objects and marks in ways to see data in a whole new way. There are many people in the data world that think that that is not going to happen, but I guess time will tell, right? So graphical marks. Now, when we have graphical marks, we have our data, right? It's in a table, spreadsheet, or database. We use these graphical marks to depict our values, our variables, our data, and the records. And then we use encoding channels to map attributes of the data to these visual graphical properties of the marks, like their positions, like the color, right? Positions, we use rows and columns in Tableau. Color, we use the marks card area. We think of maybe tilt with angle, such as with pie charts. We can specify different shapes. We can drag quantitative variables onto size or area. So these are all ways we can turn our data into this encoded language, this visual language of charts and graphs. Now, the thing that the people who originally made Tableau, people like Jock McKinley, who lives really close to where I am. He was, I think, maybe the 6th or 7th hire at the company from Xerox PARC. He was doing a lot of foundational research in this exact topic. And so here's Jock's quote about it. He talks about, if 2 principles or 2 criteria that I want you to remember: expressiveness and effectiveness. And if you've been working with charts and graphs for a long time and you don't know those 2 principles and what they mean, then this is going to be the most important thing you take out of the presentation today, okay? Expressiveness and effectiveness. These are 2 ways to gauge or judge the quality of an encoding that we use to present data, a super important part of the communication process. Let's look at them each one by one. Before we do, though, I want to talk about the notion of different scale types. So I can have categorical variables. Oftentimes we think of these as the blue pills in Tableau. We can have quantitative variables. Oftentimes these would be seen as the green pills. That's really discrete versus continuous in Tableau speak. Categories or make headers in charts and graphs. Quantities make axes in charts and graphs in Tableau. Okay. Now categories can be broken out into nominal variables. Those don't have any order to them. Names, genders, countries that we might live in. Okay. Some categories, though, have an order to them, like, let's say, Olympic medal, gold, silver, bronze. Those are different types of medals, but there's something special about them. They belong inherently in a certain order. Gold is more valuable than silver medal more valuable than bronze medal. There's many, many categorical variables you can think of that are like that. Shirt size, small, medium, large, extra large, okay? We can go on. So many different ordinal variables. We'll talk about one here in a moment. On the quantitative side of things, you either have an interval or a ratio variable. Now, what's similar about them is the distances between values are now meaningful. So temperature, let's say, that happens to be an interval quantity. And the reason is because 0 doesn't mean absolute 0 or absence of the phenomena. If we have 0 degrees Celsius centigrade or Fahrenheit, that doesn't mean absence of temperature or no temperature. It's more of a convention, right? Or an arbitrary 0 point. Whereas ratio quantities like size, weight, length, revenue, dollars, those are all variables that have a 0 that is absolute 0. When you get to 0 height, there's nothing there. When you get $0, like the bank account really is empty, right? So those are helpful to start with. Okay, now again, these ones on the top, these are my color schemes for my training. But for your purposes, think about these ones up top as the blue pills in Tableau, and these ones on the bottom, confusingly, sorry, as the green pills in Tableau. All right, so that aside, now let's think about expressiveness, because your encoding type needs to express what's in the data and nothing else than what's in the data. And it's very possible to get that wrong. Let me give you an example. Let's say we take 3 countries, okay? US, China, and India. And let's say those happen to be the 3 most populous countries in the world, all right? And at least as of right now. Let's say we want to look at their GDP in terms of trillions of US dollars. This is back in, I think, 2017. And let's say we know from the World Bank's classification that these countries fall into 3 different income groups. The United States falls into the high income group. China falls into the upper middle income group, and India falls into the lower middle income group, all right? And so you can see I've encoded those, first of all, I've encoded the GDP by the position of these dots horizontally. How far along from the left barrier, the left border on the left here, to the right, that tells me, that's encoded, a position of the GDP. The color of the dots is basically darker green for the higher income groups, lower green for the lower income groups. Now, I could have used a different encoding. I could have used just different color hues, blue, red, and orange, to encode this income group variable. Or I could use different shapes, like a circle, a square, and a triangle. But my point is that only one of these choices, of these 3, just to illustrate the point of expressiveness, only one of these 3 choices expresses the order inherent in the ordinal income group variable, which is that high income groups are higher income than upper middle income groups, which are higher income than lower middle income groups. And the only one that really does that is this left-hand side encoding. These other 2 choices for my encoding don't really express the notion of ordinality or order within the levels of that categorical variable, okay? So this is a very helpful thing to think about as we go to make charts and graphs. Is there order in the variable, and does my choice of encoding express that order? Maybe there's not an order, but my choice does express an order. Well, that would be a violation of expressiveness as well. Now, this happens actually. Like, I found this map of the United States graduation rates the other day, and I thought it was great, but then I got very confused because I noticed, I happened to be in Washington, and I noticed that it seemed like Oregon had a higher graduation rate. And I thought that because it was a darker shade of green. But when I looked more closely, I realized that actually it had a 79% of students graduating, while Washington had 87%. And that made me say, wait a minute, timeout, that doesn't make sense. So I looked at the encoding down here, okay? And I realized that it does not express the right order. Okay, so this would be a choice of shading in green here that does not express the order. It's an ordinal variable, right? We're actually binning. What we're doing there is we're binning the graduation rate into buckets, 70 to 80, 80 to 90, 90 and higher. Actually also less than 70. But then the shade of green that's chosen gets the order wrong. It puts them in the wrong order. So I remade it, and this is what I remade on the right over here. And actually I went a step further. Instead of fixing the bins, I decided that I would just, and you can notice now that Washington is higher, darker green than Oregon. And also, instead of looking at it in terms of a binning like this, I just went ahead and used the fact that I could just make a sequential color map or color encoding here to turn the quantity, instead of binning it at all, just turn the quantity to a sliding scale of saturation of that color, okay? So this one is you can find this on the web right now. This is part of a study conducted by the US Department of Education. And I noticed this. And so, I'd just like to bring it to your attention and simply make the point that people make these kinds of choices a lot in ways that expresses something incorrect about the data, okay? Now, sometimes though, this might actually not be, I'm not suggesting that this is always the best way to encode this variable. Because again, maybe the situation is that I care about a different question than this particular encoding helps me answer. For example, if my question is which states are above or below the national rate, let's say I work for the Department of Education and I'm trying to triage and know quickly and easily in a meeting all the states that happen to be below the national graduation rate average, which happens to be 85.3%. Well, this would be a very frustrating tool to use for that situation. I'm trying to look at this green scale, try to see where 85.3 is. Okay, well, oh, there it is, but I don't really see where it belongs. All right. So, what we can do in that scenario is use a diverging color scale to help us see where the pivot point is happening. Anything that's in a beige or brownish color, like these southwestern states, those are states that are below the national average. States that are in this turquoise color, and we can see that the hue switches at the exact national average. So I can also see ones that are very close to the actual exact national average. So again, a different encoding choice that expresses something different about the data, namely how close or how far away is the state from a middle point. And it doesn't necessarily mean a central point. It just means a point in between the max and the min that's relevant for some reason. Now, expressiveness is interesting because it's actually, there's a cultural component to it if you think about it, because sometimes certain color schemes express certain things. Like I would warn you against using a red and blue color map on a US map if it does not show political data, because red and blue is, especially on a US map, as we've all seen ad nauseum over the last few months, is typically expressive of political data. Also, when we talk about time, often left to right is expressiveness of time progressing from the left to the right. Now that's culturally dependent, by the way, mostly because we learn to write a language that goes from left to right. If you talk to children in an Arabic school, they oftentimes assume that time progresses from the right to the left, and that's because their language is written from the right to the left. Now, interestingly, more universal is the understanding that up is good. And that might be because gravity pulls all of us downward, no matter where we live on the surface of the planet. And it takes a lot of time, energy, money, strength to climb a mountain, go up, go higher, no matter where you're from. So we oftentimes assume by default that something that's going up is getting better. And it might be, it might not be. But it's good to know that typically your reader is going to make that baseline assumption that up is good or up is better or up is improvements. Not always, and if it's not that, like crime rate, let's say, higher the crime rate, last I checked, that's not good. We might need to go out of our way to really point out to them that up is bad in the way we annotate the chart, okay? Because these are expressiveness attributes as well. So that's something to think about. Does your chart choice, does your encoding choice express what's in the data in a way that people are going to get quickly and easily, okay? Does it follow some of these conventions? Does it break those conventions? Do the encoding choices express order if there is order? And is it in the right order, all right? Or does it express order that's not there? We might want to watch out for that. Now, the next question is about the effectiveness of those encodings. So how effective are they at expressing what's the most important to us in a given scenario, which, by the way, can be a moving target. But a couple researchers in this field, Cleveland and McGill, talked about effectiveness of encodings. And they talked about the graphical method or the chart we choose is really only successful if the reader is able to effectively decode the encoding in a way that gives them an accurate idea of what the data shows us. So Munzner, in this book I mentioned right here, okay, goes on to create this very helpful diagram, which I use as the core of my level 1 training. She most graciously put this content, which was designed by Eamon McGuire, into the public domain by the Creative Commons license. And so you can see it. You can see all the diagrams in the book. Actually, they've done that with all of them. And so you notice there's two sides to this. The left side is expressive of ordered variables. The right side, these are encoding types that are expressive of unordered variables, really just nominal, right? Ordinal has an order to them, gold, silver, bronze. Intervals, those are temperatures, those have an order to them. 50 degrees is colder than 60 degrees, right? Ratios, those also have an order to them. 70 pounds is less than 100 pounds, okay? So when we're talking about ordered magnitudes or ordinal categories, we typically use these left-hand side channels to encode those variables, which puts us in good standing from the expressiveness principle point of view, that first principle of expressiveness. On the other hand, unordered variables, we would want to use these types of encodings on the right. Now, the effectiveness principle, there's expressiveness, there's effectiveness. Effectiveness says that you want to match encodings that are high up on this list with the most important variables to your scenario, okay? Let me give you an example. Let's say we took those 3 countries again, right? US, China, and India. And we wanted to talk about GDP per capita, okay, which is more effective. This scatter plot, which shows population on the x-axis, GDP on the y-axis, and GDP per capita as a color ramp, okay? Or is this little dot plot right here a lollipop chart, which shows GDP per capita along the horizontal axis? Is that one easier to tell, right? And so I would put to you that the one on the right over here, which uses the position encoding to convey GDP per capita, is more effective. You can see that the United States is, well, maybe 5 or 6 times larger in GDP per capita than China, right? Which is also quite a bit larger than India. And it's very hard to tell with this color saturation encoding here. Why? Well, that's because if you think about it, position on a common scale is at the top of this list. That's our lollipop chart, the position of the dot, okay? Whereas the color saturation down here is lower down. So it's harder to say how much darker is the US dot in green than the green dot for China. I can definitely tell it's darker. How much darker is a much harder question to answer. And that's why we pick these, if we can, a good rule of thumb is pick those encoding types that are high up. Here we have the exact same 4 numbers, and you can see that some of them that are able to sort of answer these questions a lot quicker and easier than others. Question coming through from Alexis: when are lollipop charts more effective than bar charts? I mean, in general, I don't know if they really are. I think it's a stylistic choice many times in my point of view. It can be effective if you want to put a number in there inside the dot. Sometimes the circle can be made large enough to put a number inside of there. Yeah, so in general, I would probably, they're oftentimes going to be just trade-offs, right? Not necessarily one better than the other, but there might be some stylistic scenarios or graphical choices that might lean one toward another, perhaps. Good question. All right, so a couple more to go, and I know we're at the top of the hour here, so let's round it out. So it's important once we've picked the right encoding to focus our audience's attention on what matters the most. And I use this example here as a bad example. This is our little avoiding data pitfalls warning sign, but we take this sales superstore data. I see these dashboards a lot in Tableau, and I have over the years, both from my new students learning the software, as well as things posted in Tableau Public and such. Obviously, there's amazingly designed content, actually from both of those audiences. But here's a poorly chosen color scheme that doesn't focus my attention anywhere. It really just actually presents a lot of problems, like green and red. Well, that's already a problematic color choice. We know that because of color blindness. But also the green and red mean different things in different places. Also blue, I have blue over here, but I have blue here, but it's not the same thing, So I try to challenge myself actually to have one color mean one and only one thing on a dashboard. It isn't always possible, but many times it is. Here's a redesign of this exact dashboard. And I find that people just find this much more relaxing to see a dashboard where I limit my color choices, or certainly don't create conflicting color choices in the same exact view. Even sometimes in presentations where I'm showing more than one at a time, I try to stay consistent over time and over the presentation. These are just ways to simplify your audience's job. Once they know what yellow means, the West region, I'm good to go for your entire presentation. Anytime I see yellow, I know you're talking about the West region. Well, if you can pull that off, that's helpful. That's really great. Now, this is what I would call an exploratory dashboard. And Patrick wanted me to talk about the difference I talk about in communicating data with Tableau, about exploratory versus explanatory dashboards. So this would be another example of an exploratory dashboard, right? This shows the growth of the internet in a way that lets you explore it. I can look by region, I can filter by users, I can hover, I can filter, I can do all kinds of things to change the time. It's unguided. I'm not really telling you anything about the story of this growth of the internet. I'm letting you find the story yourself. Well, this is the exact same data shown here, and this is an explanatory dashboard that illustrates to you that the European Nordic countries led the way in internet adoption through the 90s and into the 21st century. You can see the color palette is very much limited now. Just blue for those countries I want to direct your attention to, and that same blue is used throughout. I've also gotten rid of any filters or drop downs just to kind of keep your focus on my single point that I'm trying to explain to you about an interesting finding in the data, okay? That, by the way, was very hard to see in the exploratory version, okay? And it's also true that what's fascinating about working with data, and you all know this as well as I do, that you can find more than one pattern or insight or finding in the exact same data set. Here's a different explanatory dashboard about the growth of the internet using the exact same data. Instead of looking at users per 100, we're looking at absolute number of users, okay? And I see now that the number of internet users in China surged past the United States. And so I see the timeline, because it's more central to that point, is higher up than the timeline was in the other view. The map, which is no longer central to the story, is moved lower, okay? I have red for China, blue for the US, and gray for everything else, just for context. So it's a different explanatory point that I'm trying to make. So again, think about that. Are you trying to explain something specific? Then use design cues. And I think there's no better resource than Cole Knaflich's Storytelling with Data that makes this point clear. One of the best-selling data books of the last decade. If you haven't read it, you want to pick up a copy. But she talks about that, eliminating clutter, drawing attention, designing in ways that focus your audience's attention on where you want it, okay? Now, as a side note, oftentimes I will leave them with an exploratory dashboard once I've made my point. Reason being, they might find that interesting. They may have their own ideas or thoughts about where they'd like to go with it. And so typically I'll take an explanatory route, then I'll drop them into an exploratory environment where they can choose their own adventure, right? Find a story, ask and answer their questions, which might be slightly different than mine. Last but not least, working with journalists, I learned a lot about stories and telling compelling stories, and I feel like there's two sides of a powerful message. There's the data side. We've been talking about that. Let's call that tails, facts and stats, charts and graphs, context, perspective, comparisons, data. On the other side, we'll call it the heads side of the coin for obvious reasons. That's a human side. Faces, names, stories or anecdotes, emotions, feelings. This is the impact on real people, how their lives have been affected. Put these together in your data where appropriate, in a way that's tactful, in a way that's relevant, okay? So some research into this topic, for example, which showed a number of charts and graphs to participants and asked them to see if they remembered what they'd been shown, as well as how easy they thought it was to describe what it was that the chart showed them. This placed the visualizations shown to the experiment participants in one of four quadrants. In the top left quadrants, these are highly memorable but very confusing graphs. Things like arrows and boxes, funny contraptions, these slides we've all seen with arrows and numbers everywhere, okay? So you're not gonna forget it if you see it. It's gonna stick with you. There's colors, there's shapes, there's even images or photographs or faces. It's just, I really don't know what they're telling me, okay? Highly memorable, tough to describe. Bottom left, that's for the forgettable visualizations. What does this mean? When they showed it to them, they showed them the exact same one later on in the same study. They didn't even remember that they'd seen it. These are very scientific looking. We would call these quote unquote dry. Also very technical with different kinds of bars. And it's not to say not to use them, it's just to embrace the fact that people are gonna find those intimidating, okay? Bottom right quadrant, I can explain them, but I'm not gonna really necessarily remember them. And then the golden quadrant up here in the top right, highly memorable, easy to describe. Now these use images that we're going to know, like, for example, flags or icons of shapes or photographs of people we know, like Obama and Romney, right? Or dinosaurs. These are images that stick out, that stand out. For one reason or another, we capture that as an image in our mind that we don't ever leave. And think about this last year. Images are so powerful to wake us up to the human impact of something happening. And it's very powerful to combine those with the statistical side of things and the data-driven side of things, to marry these together as two elements of the story. I had this experience one time when I was on the trail here, and I'm about to show you my very first ever Tableau public visualization that I ever made back in 2011. I was on a trail here in Seattle, and a woman and a man were walking toward me on the trail. I was by myself. And as I got closer to them, we say hello in this area when we see someone on a trail. So we said hello to each other. And then I stopped and the woman said, aren't you the person that made that Wayne Gretzky visualization? And it was kind of this weird moment. I like felt for a brief instant in time, like some celebrity. Okay. It was like my moment, right? Oh my God. I was like, oh yeah, actually I was, can I sign something? So I was like, well, I'm just curious, like, how do we know each other? And so it turns out that she and I had been on a panel together the year before. And this was the visualization about the Wayne Gretzky chart I was telling you about. Here it is, only not quite. It was a little different than this. And I was talking about this example in this panel we were presenting together. This is what it was. This was the one that I presented, the one that she asked me about on the trail almost a year later. And I thought it was interesting. And I don't necessarily think you should slap photographs or images all over. I actually had to buy this image from Getty Images. So sometimes it even costs money. But I'm just saying, my point is, I don't think we need to slap images all over everything we make. However, it's important to know that in some cases, like with this one, there was a perfect opportunity to show Gretzky, number 99, sweeping through the other 99 top NHL points earners while he's up here in the top right next to his helmet, okay? So this was something that stuck with her. And so there's the human side of it, the image, even with an interesting effect that caused her to remember it. And it related it to an experience I had before joining Tableau, where I was running a marketing team at a medical device company, realizing that, when I was presenting to the leaders about a product we'd launched, I was one of many people who were going to present to them on this full day of product reviews. And I was worried they were going to tune me right out. So instead of just showing them the units sold, configuration A and configuration B in different colors, we happened to not launch one color in configuration B. I knew that our customers were unhappy. This is a medical device, it's actually an insulin pump. And the product is the tubing that connects the pump to the person's skin, okay? That's the product I'm talking about that I was launching and that I had launched about 6 months prior to the presentation. And I knew, again, we'd only, because of cost reasons, decided to launch 3 of the configuration B colors instead of the 4 colors we launched in configuration A. I also knew that the patient didn't have a choice about A or B. It was more about their body type, tubing length, okay, as well as where they held their pump. So they were stuck with one of these 2. And so what it turned out was that, there's a lot of our customers were really upset about the fact that they couldn't get configuration B in that 4th color choice. Color and what you wear, it's on your body, you go around in your life, and that's an important choice for many people. And so people were feeling very strongly about it. So instead of just showing them the data, I showed them the data, sure I did, but then I also showed them actual quotes from social media. We played an audio clip from our helpline about someone really expressing how upset they were. And I begged the question, right? How much more would we have sold? So those are ways I tried to, in my own career, weave together both the data side and the human side to let them really feel, the weight of both of them. Now, this was a great outcome for me. The people were not going to make that decision. I needed them to remember it. And a few months later, they made the decision to launch the other color in configuration B. And it was important for me that they remembered this exact point. And so I needed to make an impact on them. And I needed for it to stick for the time when they were going to make the decision about what to do with this product down the road, okay? So I bring that to life. Now, this is really where we can then even go beyond by incorporating animation. And no one has done that better than the late Hans Rosling, Swedish public health expert and statistician. And if you haven't seen his TED Talk, The Best Stats You've Ever Seen is the title of that TED Talk. It's been viewed over 14 million times. He's a great hero of mine and many others. And so, telling that story in a way that brings it to life, engaging, exciting, passionate, drawing people in, making them laugh, making them think, okay? These are all things we try to do when we present data in our corporate environment. So that's all I've got. Those are my 5 tips I wanted to leave you with today. Know your data, know your audience, choose an effective encoding, focus their attention on what matters, and then, hey, let's throw the human side to it as well if we can. Tell a compelling story. So what? Who cares? Employees, customers. We need to answer that question in order for people to pay attention to what it is that we're trying to communicate to them. So with that, I would like to turn it back over. I know we're maybe a little bit over time, but I would like to know, do you have any thoughts about this content? Do you have any of your own tips? Did any of these resonate with you? And or, what comments or questions do you have for me? With that, maybe Jeff, would you like to take it from here? I don't know, or we can just maybe have another 5 or 10 minutes of conversation, however you all would like to do it.
Yeah, I'd say let's if there's any questions or comments out there, let's have some conversation. I think that was an amazing presentation and session. So if there's any questions out there, feel free to unmute yourselves and ask and start the conversation.
I'm curious, as I was presenting these, did any of you think to yourself, that sounds like good advice, but actually also maybe I don't agree with what's Ben's saying, or I agree with him with an important caveat, or any thoughts like that? I don't feel like I'm the final authority on any of this. This is just my point of view. So feel free to disagree. Feel free to agree. I love it when people agree. No, I'm just kidding. Feel free to just share your own thoughts and opinions. That's okay with me.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Indra. Yeah,
No,
go ahead, Indra.
Okay. Something that I struggle with, I'm fairly new with Tableau, and so some of the mistakes that you'd mentioned, I've definitely committed and identified with. What I'm struggling with the most is just being able to put the amount of information that my boss is asking me to into one dashboard and have it be something that's aesthetic, something that is informative, and not just something that looks like, 7, 8 data facts are being dumped into a piece of paper.
Right. Yeah. No, that's a great point. I mean, these dashboards get bloated, right? So I think about it in terms of the analogy I like to think about is a meal. So when you get order a meal at a restaurant, say an entree, it has multiple ingredients, right? But the best ones aren't the ones with the most ingredients. That's not what makes a meal great. More ingredients isn't necessarily a better meal. It's really, do those ingredients work well together, complement each other, textures, flavors. The more you add to it, the more challenging it becomes to have them complement each other and work well together. And so that's when I like to push back a bit and say, why do these all need to be on the exact same view? Now, sometimes they do. Think about like a war room scenario. So people need to have all the data points at their fingertips. And these are incredible design challenges where like a cockpit, of an airplane. Talk about a design challenge. This is actually the origin of human factors. This entire discipline is seeking to help people with those exact high complexity scenarios. But if we can simplify things, maybe there's a possibility to have different places where different aspects or variables are shown. Maybe there's a way to have them toggle between different states or views that maybe show a different point of view, that show a different side of the same data, but that allow us to focus. It's really common, though, that people want more and more and more. And as time goes along, they tend to evolve. Like, does your closet or your garage tend to get cleaner over time or more cluttered, right? So it requires efforts. Even when I write a book, the most painful process is editing, cutting out what has been put there, taking it out, saying, sure, I can make a case that anything can be there, but at some point I've got to make a case that everything can't be there. And I've got to decide what to cut, sentences, words. In the case of a closet, shoes I don't wear anymore. In the case of a dashboard, views or variables that aren't adding any value. But what I think is helpful is to say, again, go back to that task abstraction. What's the user? What's the task they're trying to complete or get done? What's the questions they need to have answered to do that task well? And if our answer to this is, well, it's the marketing department, as well as the finance department, as well as the facilities department, they're all using this to do the following 20 tasks. Well, you're ending up with a very difficult design challenge. And instead we say, well, maybe it's possible for us to create more focused tools for each of those different scenarios, instead of forcing all of them to try to use the same Swiss Army knife that no one knows how to use. Okay. But yeah, I sympathize with you. I don't think that it is involving a conversation with your boss and asking why everything needs to be in the same place at the same time. Yeah. Good point, though. Sure. You bet. Yeah, I agree, Timothy. I'm noticing your comment here that the advice that I gave is not easy to implement. Very much agree. Very much agree. And by the way, especially with the storytelling and the human elements, not only is that tough to implement, but it's easy to get that wrong. It's easy to overdo it with sensationalism or push emotional buttons that actually may be causing people to come to the wrong conclusions, right? So I think we need to be careful with those very powerful techniques. They're double-edged swords, and we need to use them wisely and certainly ethically and tastefully and tactfully. And those aren't necessarily always agreed upon. People might have different points of view about those exact topics, right? So yeah, I don't think that these are simple things. Just like communicating and telling someone a story or writing a book well, those are very challenging tasks that involve lots of considerations. Question from Livia. I usually ask, what's the point in between knowing the data and knowing the audience? I feel it gives me clear understanding. Yeah, so I know the data, I know the audience. Well, what's the message, I think, or the point you're saying that I want to get across? Exactly. And that was kind of baked into my know your data, but I think it's, in other words, what's the message that you want to extract from that data or convey? And it is also probably useful to call that out completely separately as its own tip. I agree. What's the message? That's really important.
Hey, Ben, I've noticed, kind of following on with what Indira was saying, I've noticed with my groups that I report to, they're so used to seeing certain types of data, certain KPIs that they want reported, certain metrics. They constantly want it all on one page, and it doesn't always all tie in well together. And I'm trying to, not that I'm an expert by any means in terms of Tableau or data presentations or visualizations, but trying to graduate them to a more professional view, and even living off of PowerPoints, if you will. Stop making me put Tableau on a PowerPoint. Go online, look at it in a different way. How do you take those baby steps to get folks and myself even there in terms of my presentation skills to get there?
Yeah, so some of the new features like navigation, allows you to bounce back and forth between different tabs in a workbook. Those are new features that we used to hack into workbooks in Tableau that they just added as native functionality. So navigation can be a way to let them go from one view to another quickly and easily. And maybe sometimes, they don't know it's there, they don't know it's possible. And so we've got to show that to them in a way that helps them see the art of the possible. That's something that I think hopefully they'll be open to that. Not everyone is. Sometimes they break out into hives as soon as you show them something different than what they're used to seeing. We all can be afraid of change in that way. But if you think about it, what I did was I just showed you a bunch of screenshots of Tableau workbooks in not PowerPoint, but Google Slides. And actually, I think that can be still effective. I just think what's missing is that, those are static views. If they have other questions about those exact views, we can't really dive into that. And so, oftentimes people think of Tableau, right? I thought about it in terms of like 3 waves of realization of the value of the platform. One is Tableau can be used to recreate all my reports. And we start there. The second is they think, Tableau is a great data discovery tool, which allows smart people, analysts to go in and find insights in the data. Very true. And they think that is the power of Tableau. And I agree, but it's not quite right, because the third thing they realize is that actually Tableau is useful for facilitating an interactive conversation with the data. Okay, what do I mean by that? We have a meeting with people who know the data, people who know the business, people who know the customer, 4 or 5 of us, the person who knows the analytics, okay? And we sit there with a workbook and we talk about the data and we think about it together and we have conversations. And someone knows the data and someone knows how to use Tableau and someone knows the business. You get those 3 people together, all of a sudden now they start going into the data set in ways that just you have this explosion of learning about what's in the data that neither one of those groups all by themselves would have been able to unlock that level of learning. So that to me is really the true power of Tableau, is that you have these group-based discovery sessions that to me are really where you kind of uncover the true value of the software, which is kind of ironic because that's really, if you go back to the story about how the software was invented in Stanford, that's exactly the scenario. Chris Stolte was building a tool for some of the researchers at Stanford to be able to ask and answer questions about their research data. And he noticed that every time he'd show them something, they'd ask a different question now. He'd have to go back and redesign it, come back and show them. They'd say, oh, well, now you show us that. I have a totally different question. So 2 or 3 weeks later, he'd be like, okay, remember that question you had 2 or 3 weeks ago? And they'd say, no, I don't remember, right? And this happens in business because we don't remember what the question was 3 weeks ago. We've already are on 4 or 5 different iterations of a similar but different question. And so the power is to be able to answer and ask those questions quickly in the same place with this group of people right there in the flow. Okay. So yeah, that's to me, I think, where you really see the value coming out of the investment in that platform. Livia says I'm asked to put Tableau on a PDF. Yeah, I think they have a save as PDF now. They like finally caved and just made that feature. Too many people were asking for it. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, again, you know, so the problem there is someone doesn't know what they're missing, maybe, that they can't interact at all in any way. So maybe if you say, here's your PDF and here's a link, you know, so usually, look, whether we like it or not, we have to give them what they ask for. Sometimes I'll just package that or sneak in there the slight kind of value illustrating icing on the cake or additional kind of piece that they maybe didn't ask for and didn't know to ask for. But once they do get it, they realize, oh, I should have asked for that. So thanks for all the kind words coming through, everyone. Alexis, Mujib, I appreciate it. I'm glad. I hope you got a lot out of it. Like I said, best of luck to you all. I know we're running out of time, so I'll turn over to Jeff here, but just want to wrap it up, at least my part of it, by saying happy holidays to everyone. Happy New Year. All the best to you all. Turning a corner here, hopefully, with these vaccines coming out, and hopefully you're able to stay healthy and thrive and be happy, and all the best to you in 2021 and beyond. If I can ever be of assistance, let me know. Here's my contact info. You can feel free to add me on LinkedIn or just email me directly. If you ever have any feedback or thoughts about my books or courses, you know, we always are learning more and more about how to continue to improve those offerings. So be happy to hear your thoughts on that. With that, Jeff, back to you.
And just to let everybody know too, this is being recorded and we will post this to our LinkedIn page, and perhaps I'll also send out a link to everybody in the emails that I send to you. So thank you. I'll be quiet and turn it back over to Jeff too.
Excellent, guys. Thank you, Ben, very much. I love the session. It was excellent. As Brian said, it is being recorded, so we'd love to have you catch the rerun. Let us know if you need anything. Please check out our Nova user group page on LinkedIn. And other than that, I think we're at time. So I'll give a sentiment by Ben. Happy holidays, everyone. This is our last meeting of 2020. Hopefully 2021 is a little bit better every year for everybody. And until then, I just want to wish everyone happy holidays and a safe and healthy new year.
Yeah, thank you again, Ben. Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody, for joining. We appreciate everybody who comes to these meetings. If you have ideas, suggestions, things you want to do, you want to present, please feel free to reach out to any of us, and we'll be happy to have you. I know I've got a couple of you that have reached out. We will get you into meetings. I promise you, we will. So thank you again. Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Patrick, for getting Ben. Thank you, Jeff, for getting us all organized. And Alyssa, who's not on, she gets us started. So thank you. Everybody have a great holiday, and we'll see you in 21.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.